Sorry, everyone. I'm just getting used to this
Perfect.
technology. I think that's it. Are we good?
All right. Guys, with that, I'm going to turn this over to Robin Koerner. Robin, thanks so much, brother, for taking your time out to talk to us about how to communicate with people from the other side.
Thank you for everything you do, Mark. And thank you to all of you who are there. Because by your being in the room, the cyber room, the virtual room, you're hopefully adding a little bit to the ability of people like us to make a difference. Can you see my presentation and my face?
I do. I don't see your face, but I do see your presentation, Breaking Paradigms and the Art of Political Persuasion.
Oh, okay. Let me try this then. If I hit the start sharing, can you see both?
Hey, there you are. We see you now.
All right. Okay. We get there. Excellent. Okay.
Fantastic.
All right. Let's see if it works, shall we? So, I want to turn... So, Mark is making sure, the Center for Self-Governance is making sure that you are effective activists because you know what you need to know to change this country for the better. However, all activists need many skills, but there's one really important skill that most of the activists that I have met on our side of the fence, as it were, don't have. And that is to be weapons of mass persuasion. Because if we're going to go out into the world and shift politics, we need to shift the culture. Culture generally precedes politics, and culture really comprises people and the minds of people. Now, if you care enough about politics to be here, you have probably had the experience of, I don't know, having an argument at a bar or perhaps on Facebook where you think, if only I just put all the facts out and then do a watertight logical argument, obviously anybody with a mind and common sense are just going to agree with me. And you might have done it 5, 10, 20, 30 times, out of which you will not have changed anybody's mind. And there are a number of reasons for that that I want to discuss today. I want today to discuss how is it that people actually make up their minds. And in particular, in relation to that, I'm going to talk about how judgment, i.e. how we come to points of view in our beliefs, and justification process, a process by which we bring facts and logic to bear to justify what we've already decided to be true. I'm going to show you that those two things are very different. You can't change somebody's mind unless you know how they make up their mind. And most of us don't even know how actually we make up our own minds, i.e. how are we persuaded. So with that little intro, I want to draw your attention to the, I hope, provocative quote of Goethe on this first slide. We see only what we know. Now, I put that there because that really encapsulates everything I'm going to talk to you about in the next hour. But it's also kind of super counterintuitive, right? Most of us think that we see something and then we can know it, or we hear it and then we can know it. But Goethe said, no. We know something first, and then that determines if we can see it or hear it. So it's kind of completely the other way around. Now, Goethe was like a early 19th century German Shakespeare, but he was very smart. And since he died in the last century or two, there have now been done many experiments to show that he was right. And indeed, if you are here and you're in sales and marketing, you probably already know from your work life that he's right. If you can understand why he's right, then you can hack the process, hack the mental process by which people are persuaded of one point of view or another. So let's go. He says, trying to move forward on the slides. There we go. Okay. Now, if you go to the university that I went to, and I studied physics, by the way, but if you studied philosophy, political philosophy or sociology, where I went to study, you would have been told to read this book that I got a picture of here. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by a guy called Thomas Kuhn. It was written in 1962. And as you can tell from the title, it's nothing to do with politics whatsoever. It's actually a very important work in the history of science. And this guy is arguably the most important historian of science there's ever been. And the reason I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this book is that he really explained, elucidated the idea of the paradigm. And it turns out that the idea of the paradigm isn't just important for learning how, for understanding how scientific knowledge advances, which is what Kuhn was interested in. But it's also important to understand understanding how political knowledge advances and changes. This notion of a paradigm, said Kuhn, is very important because it doesn't just determine how we interpret our experience. It determines the very experience we can have. Okay. Now, obviously, you've seen this. If you're a conservative and you hear like liberals talking about political issues, issues of liberty, or whatever it might be, the Constitution, it's like they're living in a different universe. Well, Kuhn says they are living in a different universe, given that the universes that we live in are in our heads, right? Now, what is a paradigm? A paradigm is a set of concepts and the relationships among those concepts, through which we can understand our world and even perceive our world. Now, there are many kinds of paradigms. Thomas Kuhn was talking about scientific paradigms, right? So, for example, Newtonian physics and Einsteinian relativistic physics. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But there are also cultural paradigms, linguistic paradigms. We'll give some examples of those. You could even say national paradigms. What do I mean? I mean, if you are brought up in this country, you're going to have a set of understandings and concepts through which you understand the world that are quite different from those that a Frenchman might have, such that when you see the same thing, when the same thing is in front of your eyes, you may have a very different experience. Now, and this goes to Goethe's point, that what you know, those concepts, the concepts that are built into your paradigms, built into your language, determine what you can actually perceive. Now, most of those concepts are obviously implicit in our vocabulary. And something that Kuhn said is that in different paradigms, the very same words can actually have different meanings. Now, I'm going to start off being a little academic and abstract, and then I'm going to get less and less abstract and more practical. And I'm going to get less and less academic and more kind of political and into what you study with the Center for Self-Governance there. So let's just start with the abstract, because I want you to understand why the things I'm going to teach you work. Because if you understand why they work, you'll understand why they're important, and I think they're going to stick better. So, to use Kuhn's famous example from his book, Einstein's universe and Newton's universe. You may remember back in high school physics that Newton had these concepts of mass, space, time, and none of them changed, right? Space and time are like a background that everything happens in. That's Newton's conception of the universe. It doesn't matter how fast you kick the football, it always has the same amount of mass in it. Mass doesn't change. Now then Einstein comes along hundreds of years later. Oh, and by the way, it's worth saying that you can perfectly well understand the world through Newton's paradigm, right? His notions of mass, his notions of time, his notions of space. And indeed, we understood the world just fine using Newton's ideas for 200 or 300 years. But then Einstein comes along, and Einstein tells us that space and time are actually curved. Depending on how you may be moving and how fast you may be moving, the rate at which time ticks by changes. Depending on whether you stick a heavy planet in the middle of a galaxy, the space and time around it curve. Depending on how fast you're running, you have more or less mass, E equals mc squared. You've heard of that. So here you have two different ways of understanding the universe with exactly the same words in. And the concepts meant by those words, let's say time and space and mass, they're kind of similar, but they're in other ways profoundly different. They're similar enough that if you used them in passing, you wouldn't even see the differences. But they're different enough that you actually cannot explain Einstein's universe to someone with Newton's concepts. Actually, you can't do it. Now, let's bring it a little bit more down to earth. Use an example from our own language. We all speak English. In English, there is a word home. Where I lay my head is home. This condo is my home. But you can also use the word in English to say, let's say if you go for a vacation, you go to Portland for a week, and you're living in a hotel for a week, right? You can go out one day and you can say to your friend, you know what, I'm going to go back home now. I'll meet you back at the hotel later. Now that's another use of home. In other words, this word home has a rather complex meaning that you can really only understand by understanding all the different ways we use it and understanding how it's related to other words and concepts in English. It turns out that no other language has a direct translation of the word home. Now, if you could speak French, you could explain the meaning of the word home to a Frenchman, but you couldn't just pick one word that means the exact same thing. What you'd actually have to do is kind of think like someone who speaks English, then think like someone who speaks French, and then kind of stand outside of both linguistic paradigms and do a kind of a long-winded explanation pointing at the meaning of this English word home. Okay, now you might get that or you might not, but let's bring it to politics. I studied Chinese. Now the word for should in Chinese, as in, I should get up tomorrow at 8 o'clock. You should not murder. That word is ingai. And you can translate text, English text, should to ingai and ingai to should for years, and you're going to be more or less fine. Until one day you discover that actually should in English and ingai in Chinese, which looks like a direct translation, actually have completely different meanings. Why? What does the word should in English imply? What are the unstated assumptions built into that word and therefore built into the English linguistic paradigm? Should implies there exists some external standard of behavior or morality according to which a certain behavior, a specific behavior, is acceptable or another is not, or better and another is worse. Okay, it's kind of moralistic. It comes out of actually a Judeo-Christian kind of conception of the universe. Now, the Chinese are not Judeo-Christians. They are Confucians. They don't have abstract moral systems according to which they should act. Now, obviously, I'm generalizing hugely, but bear with me. Being Confucians, what their culture values is harmony. Harmony is a much more pragmatic concept than our kind of Judeo-Christian, divinely inspired, let's say, morality, complete with its laws of nature that operate independently of our behavior. So when a Chinese person says I should do something, he more often means that by doing this thing, it's not according to some moral system, but it promotes harmony. Why is this important? Well, think of all those times when Obama and, the Chinese president meet in a room at the United Nations, right? And all of Obama's people are saying, oh, you have to talk to the Chinese about human rights. We have to get them to understand this. What they're doing out there is absolutely outrageous. We've got to spend political capital with the Chinese and hold their feet to the fire when it comes to human rights, not mistreating prisoners, whatever it is. So let's say Obama has some success, and then CNN and MSNBC and all the crowd say, this is great. We've had this great victory at the UN with China. The Chinese now recognize, the politicians will say, they're doing what they should do. They recognize that they should do X, Y, and Z and make these changes. And then we think we've had a moral victory. And the Chinese media is saying what? Well, they might be saying they're doing what they should do, ingai should do. But it doesn't mean the same thing to them, right? What it means to them is they have made a concession to those Westerners that promotes harmony. Harmony which gives them room to move. It's a pragmatic thing. By establishing harmony, there's now more things they can do in relation to the West, let's say. It's kind of like political capital that they've bought with us. So it's a very different conception of the world. And there we are the English speakers, the Americans, the Chinese speakers, the Chinese, looking at exactly the same situation, having participated in exactly the same situation, but believing they've done completely different things. And in their world, they have done completely different things. Kuhn's word for this is incommensurate. Paradigm's incommensurate. You can't directly translate from one to another. The same words, or as near as damn it, the same words, have even different meanings in different paradigms, which are a function of a load of relationships of those meanings with others, many of which we don't even consciously see or think about. Now, if you're already getting ahead of the game here, you'll be thinking that, oh yeah, this is kind of like liberals talking to conservatives or conservatives talking to liberals. When we say, oh, we talk past each other, we actually do talk past each other. Now, Kuhn makes a really strong point, therefore. He says, when your paradigm changes, your world changes. Now, you might say, well, that's ridiculous. There's an external world out there that's quite independent of what I think about it. Well, that's true. And this is not an argument against objective reality or absolute morality or any of those things. It's not an argument for relativism metaphysically. It's just noting that the only way we as human beings can access this objective truth is through our minds, where our subjectivity, it's not software, it's actually hardwired. And I'm going to talk about the fact in a minute that when you want to change somebody's mind, you are actually rewiring their brain. And facts and logic never work. They never work in doing that. They're sometimes useful after you've succeeded to reinforce the change of mind, but alone they are not enough. So as Kuhn said, you cannot experience anything objectively. Now, there was a wonderful experiment done in 1949 in Harvard, and it was called the Perceptions of Incongruity Experiment. And it's quite a simple experiment, and it worked like this. They had a bunch of participants who were participating one at a time, and the scientists would simply flash up a playing card at the participants, and the participant had to say what card they were looking at. So 3 of spades, 7 of hearts, king of diamonds, very simple. Now this was done at high speed. Now the participants were wired up to various instruments to determine their physiological stress. So their heart rate is being measured. The sweat on their skin, which is also an indicator of stress, is being measured. And you measure that by measuring electric currents going through the skin. All these kind of things. So we're measuring the stress experienced by these people who are doing nothing more than simply calling out the names of playing cards. Very simple, right? But what the participants didn't know was that some of the red cards had been colored black. So there was like a 7 of hearts, but it was black. Or a 3 of clubs, but it was red. What do the people call out in that experiment? Do they say, oh, hold on, that's a black 3 of hearts? No, they don't. Because as Goethe said, they see only what they know. And what do they know? They know, actually they're assuming it, but it's an assumption with the strength of knowledge. What they know is they're looking at a pack of playing cards. So given that they know that they're seeing red hearts and diamonds and black clubs and spades, when they actually see the black 3 of hearts, they don't say black 3 of hearts. What they say either is 3 of hearts, or maybe 3 of spades, or maybe 3 of clubs. And that is actually what they are directly perceiving. Now, here's why I'm going into all this detail about this. They don't look at that card and do any kind of analysis or interpretation. They immediately perceive something that isn't there. It's completely unmediated. And if you are strongly committed to a political paradigm, that is how your interpretation, your very perception of the world works. So we're in the business of rewiring brains. So you have to take this quite seriously. And that's why all these little Facebook arguments invariably fail. Now, okay, so that might... Oh, and by the way, yeah, so what happens was, I finished this little story about this experiment. They slow the rate down at which they show these weird cards, right? So, you know, these black 7 of hearts, they start by showing them fast. So they slow down the rate. And they slow it down. They let them, the participants see these cards for longer and longer. And those instruments are showing increasing stress responses, right? So the heart rate, the skin, it's showing that there's something wrong. But these folks, consciously, they're still seeing things that actually they're not seeing. Consciously, they don't know anything that's wrong. But unconsciously, their body is resisting. Until eventually, when they show these cards slowly enough, finally somebody goes, oh my God, hold on, that's a kind of fake card. That's a black 3 of hearts. Oh, hold on. Now, at this point, they know something new. They know that what they're looking at is not a real pack of playing cards. After that point, they can see everything that is actually in front of their eyes. And the stress disappears immediately. And that's registered on those instruments. So not only can we not see objectively, notice this, and this is critical for what we're doing. Our paradigms, what we know, changes what we perceive in a way that always reinforces the paradigm, right? So when you are seeing a black 3 of hearts, when you're looking at a black 3 of hearts, but you're experiencing a normal red 3 of hearts, you've just given yourself a bit of data that is false, but reinforces the paradigm that all of these cards are actual playing cards. Are you understanding me? Does that make sense, Mark? I can see you, Mark. Not if that was clear to folks.
That's very clear, brother.
Okay, excellent, good.
By the way, you have
so now
this
is the
questions
groundwork
that are starting to pile up into the questions.
Oh, okay. Should I take them right now?
That is totally up to you. And by the way, you can, if you look over to your right, Robin, on the Q&A pod, just to your right, if you go to the presenter view, it'll show you who the questions are assigned to. And all you need to do is decide when you want to answer those questions, okay?
Okay, so everything I'm seeing says that there's a connection problem.
There shouldn't be.
I'm not seeing direct questions about content. Oh, and now I've lost the whole. Okay, yeah. Am I looking at the wrong thing?
Okay, look to your right. You might be. Look to your right on your screen, and you'll see a Q&A pod. You can see it moving around.
I'm seeing a little box that says Adobe Connect. That's all I see is a little box that says Adobe Connect. So you know what?
Oh,
I'm gonna.
Okay. So.
It's a little box like this in the corner of my screen. Yeah, and all the questions and problems are all about the connection. So I'm going to carry on, and if somebody wants to type in there if I need to be doing something else, Pamela, if you can tell me where I need to go for this Q&A pod, if it's different from the one I'm looking at, where you've written, be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A pod. You tell me how to get to that pod, and I will take the questions shortly. Let me finish the point here. Meanwhile,
Sure.
Now, I've given you there a little experiment to explain some of the neurology, I guess, empirical psychology that underpins Goethe's insight, that we see only what we know. It's actually literally true. Now, in 2006, for example, 45% of Republicans stated that Iraq had WMDs. 28% stated they had been found. Now, obviously, this is to do with the commitment of Republicans to supporting their Republican president. Although some people have argued since that there were, in fact, WMDs in Iraq, I would dispute that. Most people don't believe that. At that time, there was no evidence that even the administration itself had given, let alone the media, to justify 45% of Republicans, to justify anybody saying that there were WMDs in Iraq. But we believed they were there because it suited, let us say, the political identity of a large portion of people. In other words, it was consistent with the paradigm. Now, in 1968, this might be even more astonishing, I don't know. In 1968, as the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary and Czechoslovakia was happening only a few hundred miles to the east, French communists actually denied en masse that it was going on. At the actual time it was happening, as it was being televised, they genuinely just couldn't believe it. Again, now this makes a little more sense when you can see how this operates over something as simple as playing cards, where nobody actually has even a vested interest in believing they're seeing playing cards, right? Now, let's actually start making this really relevant to our situation here in America. Some time ago, there was a headline on the Drudge Report, and I'm sure you know the Drudge Report, and the headline was this: Iran test fires missile that can reach Israel. Now, in the spirit of this presentation, there is something profoundly wrong with that headline. Now, I should say that the headline was factually accurate. It was a few years ago. This is an old headline, but it perfectly illustrates the point here. It was an accurate headline, and of course, I have no reason to believe that Matt Drudge was trying to mislead anyone. But there's something wrong with it. And if I had you in the room, I would ask, this would be an interactive bit, and I would ask you to tell me what you think is wrong with that headline. So maybe just spend 3 seconds thinking about it, and then I will give you the answer. Iran test fires missile that can reach Israel is not a statement of the facts on the ground, as much as it is a statement of the American understanding of Middle Eastern politics. Why? Because the implicit assumption in the headline is that the meaning of that missile, the importance of that missile, relates to Israel. Now, nearly all Americans, Matt Drudge included, naturally believe that the main conflict in the Middle East is which conflict? Between Israel and the Arabs, or you might prefer the Jews and the Muslims, but that religious fault line. It is not. The most important geostrategic, geopolitical fault line in the Middle East is between the Persians and the Arabs, closely related to the Sunni and the Shia. That missile was important because it was a Persian missile, and it was aimed at the Arabs, not the Jews. So to understand the implications of that missile, of what the Iranians were doing, you had to know that all of the reaction came from the Arabs, Saudi Arabia in particular. Why? Any missile that can reach Israel from Iran can hit Saudi Arabia. That was the important thing about that missile. Again, what do we see here? If you're an American reading that, there is a true statement, a true perception, right, that reinforces the American largely incorrect understanding that the main fault line geopolitically in the Middle East is the one between Israel and the Arabs or the Muslims. So here you see it again. You see here how our mainstream media, how all the facts we get are obviously, forget left versus right, they're filtering, their perceptions are also determined by, let us say, the American paradigm, which is shared by us, the consumers of media and news and politics, and those who produce our news and our media and our politics, right? There's us, the citizens, there's those mainstream politicians and the media, and we're all filtering through our paradigm because we can only use the paradigm we've got. Now, so I think we've established quite clearly that paradigms determine perceptions, not just interpretations. And they determine the meanings of the very concepts that constitute those paradigms. Now, let's just have a little game here and prove the point. What is that, everyone? This is not a trick question. That, call it out. It's a horizontal line. What's that then? Yep, vertical line. So what's that? 2 horizontal lines. Not a trick question. And that one? 2 vertical lines. Now call that. What's that? Just call it out. Okay. If you're a normal human being, you just called out a square, because that's what it is. But nobody says it's 2 pairs of parallel lines, one horizontal, one vertical, joined at their ends, which is also what it is. Now, why don't you say that? Because when you see that square, there's a bunch of synapses firing in your brain. There are synapses firing for line, the concept of line. We can stick you in an fMRI brain scanner and see the synapses that are firing for line. We can see also the synapses that are firing for two, as in pairs. There's two pairs of lines, and we can detect that in the brain with sufficiently sophisticated technology. We can see synapses which are firing because you're looking at a vertical line or two vertical lines and horizontal lines. But separately, when you see square, there's another little batch of synapses that are firing, neurons, I should say neurons really, that are firing for square. The point being that you immediately perceive that square. You've learned it, it's hardwired. It's hardwired, your perception of square is hardwired. You don't analyze the lines individually and work out that they're a square. Here's how people's politics work as well, right? You've got to hack that immediate perception, right? So when somehow when I don't know, Obama's been talking about guns recently, right? When somebody sees a gun rights advocate or hears a gun rights advocate and they're from the left and you are advocating for Second Amendment, just like they see the square, they see somebody that doesn't care about the lives of all of these children that get killed in mass shootings in school. We are rewiring brains. It's difficult. Okay. Now, I like to loosen up everybody's paradigms all the time. So I hope that you're a little surprised to see me give you a quote from Noam Chomsky. You don't get a lot of quotes from Noam Chomsky among constitutional conservatives, but I like truth whoever says it, and I would say Chomsky captures this quite well. The smart way to keep people passive and obedient, he says, and this is very, very important for activists, right? Especially activists that are going into City Hall. Says Chomsky, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system, I put that in bold, are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. Presuppositions of the system is Chomsky speak for what? The paradigm. And of course, it's the paradigm that sets incorporates the presuppositions of the system that limit the debate to things that reinforce the paradigm, right? Chomsky's right. Okay, now hold on a second. Let me see if I can take these questions. I'm not seeing the questions anywhere. Okay, so I see attendees, speaker, mute my microphone, video, and share. They're the only things I see on this little Adobe Connect box. So how do I get to this Q&A? How do I get to see this? Can somebody tell me? Pamela, write something in the Adobe Connect box where you've just written, feel free to share your webcam, and show me where I can go to some of these questions.
So Robin, do you see this Q&A box here?
I can't see a Q&A box. I just see an Adobe Connect box.
All right, so I'm going to request control. Can you give me control of the screen?
Go ahead.
Do I have control?
I don't know how you do it. I haven't got any. I've not been asked to give it to you. Oh, hold on. I get a little things popped up here. Pamela Leslie requested. Oh, I see. Okay, got it. Yes. Oh, I see. You're Pamela for today. Are you, Mark?
I am.
I get it now.
You can call me Caitlin. Okay. All right. So the first question here, you can just go through them one by one as you like, Robin.
I can't see any. I just see a little box that says no new notifications. Do I go? Okay. Maybe if I go back.
So the first question, Robin, is. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
Of course. Please don't share it outside this group. Oh, by the way, you can also get a version of this presentation on DVD at my website, robinkoerner.com.
Okay. The next question is, Let's see. This comes from Kit Arbuckle. His question is, what would we hold these truths to be self-evident mean in the Chinese Confucianist paradigm?
What would I would say I would have to have a lot more of a sophisticated understanding of Chinese culture and have lived there for much longer to know how even you would translate self-evident into Chinese. I would say, by the way, that this actually deserves a long answer, but it's going to take us quite a long way from this. I would say it relates to a fundamental difference between Chinese thought and Western thought. In Western thought, you get to truth by understanding the parts of everything, and then understanding the way those things are put together, the relationships between them, and that's how you understand the whole. That's what science does. It's essentially reductionistic. Okay. So to us, in the West, truths, if we say something self-evident, we say they're axiomatic, in as much as when you state them, they authenticate themselves. Right? Now, in Chinese, to understand the truth about something, you have to understand it as a whole. To understand the thing is to understand its relationships rather than the thing in and of itself. And that goes back to the I Ching, which is called the Book of Changes, which some would say is the foundation of Chinese philosophy. So, but I'm not here to do a class on Chinese philosophy, so I think that would be getting a long way away. And you know what? The best way to get a good answer to that is to go find some Chinese friends and ask them, because they would probably give you a better answer than I would.
That's right. Hey, Robin, we do have Jerry Friedenberg has a question. Her microphone is unmuted. So, Jerry, if your microphone is working, go ahead and ask your question. All right, so she hasn't figured out how to get her microphone to work. So, Jerry, you'll have to ask your question in the Q&A box. Joy Stavely asks you, Robin, if you're not familiar with cards, then the red and black would not have any significance, right? Can you give one more example besides playing cards?
Oh, well, I use that example because it's an experiment that was done, and there's lots of data on it. All of the examples I have given are examples of that effect. I mean, the headline on the Drudge Report is an example that is, an everyday example, right? Somebody has a paradigm about the nature of a thing, the conflict in the Middle East. There's a missile. He perceives a missile as something that can hit Israel, which it is in that case, but he's missing actually what the missile is for. I mean, the headline implies the missile is to hit Israel. The missile really isn't. The Iranians are bothered about the Arabs. The Persians are bothered about the Arabs. It's almost incidental that it can hit Israel. I mean, obviously not completely, because obviously there is a conflict between the Jews and the Iranians, the Muslims. But if you actually looked at the Middle East when that event happened, the reaction came from the Arabs, right? So the meaning of the thing, like the essence of the thing, wasn't seen by the media who reported the thing, right? Or put another way, what was seen by both the media reporting it and we who consume the reports is a version of reality that reinforces our misunderstanding, our wrong paradigm of that part of reality. So it's exactly the same as the playing card experiment. I don't know of other experiments, that I can give you a title and a date and where it was done and all of that. That makes the same point as the playing card experiment in Harvard. But I mean, it's just such a perfect encapsulation of it that I found that one and I thought perfect, and that's the one I always use.
Jerry Friedenberg got her question submitted, Robin. Examples on how to use the shift of paradigm, please.
Okay, so that's what's going to be kind of the second half of this. So Let me carry on, and I think I will speak to that. And now I'm seeing the box, the Q&A box is the box that it's not called a Q&A box for me, it's called just Adobe Connect. And because I see that question there, examples of how to use this material. So now, okay, and then I now see Richard Miner's. I now see Richard Miner's question, and I'm actually going to give an example that speaks directly to that at the end of this presentation. Almost exactly to that question. Okay?
All right. And then there are a few other questions, and then what we'll do is we'll hold on to those. We'll go ahead and hold on to those for till the end of the seminar, okay?
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So, now, so let's actually talk a little bit about Chomsky talks about the presuppositions of the system. So let's talk about what the system is. Now, look, this is an introductory talk, and I give a day on this stuff, and I really go into the details. So this is kind of a first pass. But obviously, our political paradigm is, you can broadly understand it as left versus right? We have left, right, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats. And to whatever extent that is or isn't the whole story, let's try and understand that, because we need to. It's the first reason. And second, if we can understand that, we're going to be good at applying the general understanding about paradigms here more broadly. So let's actually talk about, with our paradigm hat on, what left versus right means. What are the implicit assumptions in left and right, that are filtering our politics, okay? Now, let's think about the words then, Because obviously, as Kuhn was saying, our paradigms comprise concepts that has an attached vocabulary, and the vocabulary contains assumptions and implications that we don't even know is limiting not only our way of thinking about our world, but our way of perceiving it. Now, the most basic thing then to say about left and right is, well, what are left and right? They are directions, Left, well, I guess if you're looking at me on the camera, that's right, that's left. Left and right are directions, or they are sides. As I'm sitting here looking into the camera, everything is either left or right. There is no space that isn't on my left or on my right, okay? So built into those words is that left and right cover all space. So when we use them in politics, we're subconsciously assuming that they cover all political space. Now, if you are smart enough to be at a CSG class, you know that's rubbish, You know that when you've heard from the liberal and the conservative, the Democrat and the Republican on a CNN, talking 5 minutes about some issue, that when you've heard from those two people, you haven't heard all there is to hear about the issue. But we don't demand what we are not being told if we believe we've heard the left position and the right position. Why? Because that's built in to our notions of left and right. It's all space, left and right. There isn't anything that isn't left and right. Okay, that's the first one. That's the first way in which that paradigm limits our ability to see, let us call it, political truth, or the truth even about our situation. What else do we know about left and right? Simple concepts. They are opposites. So again, you hear from the left and you hear from the right, the liberal and the conservative position on an issue, and it's like you assume, you probably don't because you're CSG students, but everybody else out there, the people writing the news and 99.9% of the people consuming it, think that they've heard opposing points of view. Well, you and I know invariably they haven't. Left and right stop us from seeing that the Republican and the Democrat who might be talking about, choose your issue, actually aren't opposed on the fact that the best way to solve a problem in the world is, with the military, aren't opposed on the fact that the violation of our Fourth Amendment is perfectly acceptable if they think it's going to help them secure us, which of course it won't. They are not opposed on the relationship between, let's say, financial corporations and our government. They are not opposed on expanding the power of government at the expense of individual sovereignty. They're not opposed on almost anything. Why is that important? It's super important because, and this is almost by definition true if you think about it, the situation that we find ourselves in as a country, our takedown of our liberties, most of that is determined more by what all of the politicians and the political establishment agree upon than by what they are opposed on. So there they are, left and right, and we're looking at the argument, but it's like the top of an iceberg. The top of the iceberg is the bit they disagree on, but our world, our country, our experience is determined by all of those things that they are not opposed on. That kind of is the rest of that iceberg. But we're told it's left versus right. We see the representative of the left, seeing the representative of the right. We think we're seeing opposites. We're not. We're generally seeing agreement on all of these things, which are invariably contrary to our founding principles. Okay. Now, here's a term. I don't know if there are any scientists in listening to this. But there's a certain, well, everyone knows what the common meaning of the word symmetrical is, right? Like a mirror image would be symmetrical, or a square is symmetrical, or whatever. A circle has infinite symmetry. Okay, that's the common meaning of symmetry. But there's this kind of scientific and more technical meaning of symmetry, which is that one thing can be mapped onto the other thing with a simple operation. In other words, A and B are the same kind of thing. Now, left and so in a scientific sense, they're symmetrical. They have symmetry. Now, left and right are the same kinds of thing, right? They're both, as I said, directions or sides. We do not say when we're talking about politics, left and trees or right and green, right? We don't say that. They're completely different class of things. We talk about the same class of things. People on the left and people on the right, they're both still doing politics. Now, if that's all sounding a bit weird, let me explain what I'm talking about. You have probably had this experience. If you have friends on the left and right, I'm going to assume if you're in this class, you probably call yourself something of a liberty activist, maybe a constitutional conservative, those kind of things, maybe a classical liberal. But you've probably got friends on the left and right. And you've probably noticed that your friends on the left think that your friends on the right are generally what? Usually callous, not caring, right? Just not as good people, a little heartless. That's what most people on the left think of people on the right. But what do the people on the right think about the people on the left? Do they think the same thing, or do they generally think a completely different thing? Generally, they think a completely different thing. People on the right usually don't think people on the left are heartless. Actually, we often call them bleeding hearts, right? What we usually think if we're on the right about people on the left is not that they're bad, but that they're stupid. Notice that? People on the left think that those on the right are bad. People on the right think that those on the left are stupid. This is how paradigms work out in political discourse. And here is the graph, which I've never seen anywhere, but I think this is massively important. Now, obviously, I'm generalizing. If you do my day-long seminar, I go into the specifics of this and I qualify this. But this is like a kind of a first-order approximation. Why is that? You need to understand paradigms to understand why this operates. The politics of the left are the politics of good intention. The politics of the left are the politics of good intention. Now, that doesn't mean that liberals are better people than conservatives. Actually, the data show that conservatives give more time and more money to achieve the goals that liberals say they want. Very clear data. But how do people on the left generally experience their own politics? So this is key. If you're going to change somebody's mind, you have to understand how they come to their political judgments, right? So broadly speaking, if you're on the left, you observe that there is this thing called government and this thing called law. And it's a common sense view that we're always going to be stuck with both of those things. Given that they exist, surely it's better to use them to manifest, to enforce good intentions, right? I mean, we all want more justice rather than less. We all want less poverty more rather than more. We all want, or you can choose your thing, right? Most people on the left also want more equality rather than less, etc. Fairer distribution rather than less fair. Now, we can argue about what those terms mean, but we all like justice, right, etc. We all dislike poverty. We all want more caring and less harming of others. If you believe that the mechanism is a given, the mechanism for delivery of these things is just a given, it's kind of neutral, it's just kind of a conduit that's always there, as folks on the left generally do, as I used to myself, which is why I'm kind of good at speaking to folks on the left, then it's just common sense that, well, let's at least just try and do good using these tools that we have. Now, so here's the point. If for me, I choose my policies because they better manifest or encapsulate my good intentions. So my commitment to policy and to politics comes from my good intentions. If you disagree with me on those policies, then it's completely logical from my paradigm to infer that you don't have the same good intentions as I do. So I impugn your morality, your intentions, your integrity, for example. Now, if I'm a conservative, I know it doesn't work that way. If I'm a conservative, I don't believe you can simply just use government and law to enforce good intentions and get better outcomes, because I know that the mechanism itself, right, the use of law itself, the use of government as force itself is going to have a greater effect on my outcomes than the good intentions. If I believe that, my intentions don't get me alone to my policies. I have to look at the mechanism of trying to get the intentions to decide on what policies are good or better. So if I, as a conservative, think that a certain policy is going to be better because I've looked at the relationship between implementation and outcome, and I'm looking, therefore, let's say I'm being empirical, I'm looking at a set of facts. I'm often looking at history if I'm a conservative, right? I'm saying, when government tries to do something, look, we've got all of this evidence, we get all of these unintended outcomes because we're trying to use force. It's like you push in a balloon here and it pops out somewhere else. Then we have another government solution here, and we push it in here and it pops out somewhere. Okay, so for me, it's not about operating on a moral intentional axis. That's the horizontal axis on this slide. For me, politics and support of policy is much more a functional thing, right? So for my conservative paradigm, it's about knowing what's so. So if somebody disagrees with me, if they can't see that a certain policy is better than another, like I can see, then they're not bad, they're just stupid. They just haven't seen what's in front of their face. So you see, here we are, conservatives sitting in the conservative paradigm, judging the specific political commitments of liberals from a conservative paradigm, right? So here you go. Conservatives, we're here on the functional axis. The liberal disagrees with me, so they're on the wrong side of the wrong end of the functional axis. If I'm liberal, politics I support are about manifesting my intentions. You don't support the same politics and policies, so I interpret you, the conservative, through my liberal paradigm, and I impugn your intentions. In both cases, we can't talk to each other, right? This is why liberals and conservatives never change anybody's mind until they can experience the world like one of their opponents. So the act of changing the mind is the act of thinking into the world of your opponent. Just an example, but it's a very good one. Now, what then do we do about that? Well, America, ironically, you might say, given the fact that we are so politically divided into two camps, no less. America is the country of sales and marketing. It was built on sales and marketing. And there are millions of great salesmen out there that know what to do in these situations. They know, these salesmen, that people's minds are changed by emotional consent, not logical argument. And indeed, if you're an activist, if you're doing politics, if you need to persuade people to your point of view, you're really doing psychology. But rather than trying to sell a product, you're trying to sell an idea. You could say your idea is your product, or your philosophy is your product. But you're still in the sales and marketing business. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that's done. But it rests on this, and this is super, super important. And every time you go into City Hall, right, every time you go into City Hall to implement some of these things that you're being taught by CSG, I want you to remember this little encapsulation. Judgment and justification are completely different processes. I mentioned that when I introduced the presentation. They actually happen in different parts of the brain. People make judgments, in other words, i.e. they come to decisions for reasons entirely different from those given to justify their decisions and judgments. Okay? Salesmen know that. The way people actually make their judgments, it's invariably emotionally driven, and what is driving them are usually subconscious. So if you can understand that process, if you can actually understand what drives someone to come to certain decisions, certain positions, you may well know more about how they got to the decision than they do themselves. Because, as I say, the process is mostly subconscious. However, the justification for the position you end up in is conscious, is usually logical, is usually fact-based. But it's always post hoc. Now, most people, including most activists, most of the time, you know, those Facebook arguments, what they do is they use the justifications for their own positions on other people, right? Thinking that the justification is going to get somebody else to come to a judgment. No, different process. Salesmen know it. Let's talk about it. Okay. Now, I'm going to use an example straight from politics. Back in 2004, during the run-up to the 2004 presidential election, while undergoing an fMRI brain scan, I told you they could do this, 30 men, half self-described as strong Republicans, half self-described as strong Democrats, were tasked with assessing statements by both George Bush and John Kerry in which their candidates clearly contradicted themselves. This is important. This means the logical content to what they were listening to was 2 + 2 = 5. That was the logical structure of what they were hearing. It was an internal contradiction. Yet in their assessments, Republican subjects were as critical of Kerry as Democratic subjects were of Bush, yet both let their own candidate off the hook. What does that actually mean, let them off the hook? It means that they interpret 2 + 2 = 5 from their opponent, completely different from how they interpret it when it comes out of the mouth of their guy. Of course, in ways that help them to preserve their political commitments, their political paradigms. They were in fMRI brain scanners. What was going on in the brain when they were assessing what they were hearing from Kerry and Bush? Well, this is the answer. The part of the brain that handles emotions, firing on all cylinders. Okay? So the initial response is emotional. And you know that. I actually did another experiment on this just yesterday when Obama gave his speech on guns. And most of my crowd, obviously, well, indeed, I don't agree with Obama, well, on hardly anything. And most of the people that follow my group, I have 15,000 people on my Blue Republican Facebook group, they don't follow Obama either. Agree with Obama on most things either. And most of them are obviously, most of them are pro-Second Amendment. So when I said something about Obama's speech that was positive, that it was a speech like the one he gave in the campaign back in 2008 that got all those people to speak for him, and that it was it had a lot of leadership kind of in it, and I wasn't agreeing with it, right? At no point did I agree with it, but I said that, you know, it looked like he really meant it, and that there was some authenticity in it. The number of people who actually agree with me politically, who were so upset because I didn't hate him enough, and I mean, I literally got messages, right? I'm leaving your page because Obama is a liar and you should hate him, right? Because I didn't hate him, right? They didn't want to be there anymore. They couldn't handle it. They couldn't even stick around. Although that for the last 3 years, it's probably the only kind of nice thing I had to say about Obama. They couldn't handle it. Why? Because they had this visceral emotional reaction that came from their political paradigm. Now, so we have an emotional reaction to people that we favor or disfavor that is rooted, by the way, or strongly related to the third line in this little matrix, judgments about moral accountability. We're going to make an assessment about a statement 2 plus 2 equals 5 or its logical equivalent, based on what we judge about the moral accountability of the person who makes it. We're going to have an experience of conflict. If I'm a Republican who supports Bush, and I hear my guy Bush say something that's obviously wrong because it contradicts itself, I've got a cognitive dissonance problem. I have to come up with an excuse that I am satisfied to let it go. Now, I might say, let's say it's a slip of the tongue, right? But I'm not going to say that for Kerry. For Kerry, I'm going to say, because I have to make a different judgment about his moral accountability, that consistency only goes to show that he doesn't care about truth. It only proves the point that he's an idiot, whatever it might be, right? I'm going to argue away the problem in a completely different way. When I've done that, I'm going to have my cognitive dissonance resolved. That conflict resolution part of my brain, I'm going to get a big dopamine hit. Reward and pleasure centers, the ventral striatum, it's going to fire when I've resolved it and I can feel good about myself again and good about my team. Okay? In other words, not only are we hardwired to see the world in a way that reinforces our paradigm, we actually get a hit like taking heroin or seeing your loved one. Neurologically, it's the same thing. When we have worked out how to keep our paradigm in place. Okay? So you're working against that as a political activist too. But importantly, the part of the brain that does nothing is the bit that does logic and math. If you're actually working out 2 plus 2 equals 4 on a math page, the bit that's doing it is the front of the brain. But when you hear that, or a logical equivalent coming out of a politician, someone who, you relate to in a political way, in a moral way, that part of the brain isn't interested. So stop with all those Facebook arguments with facts and logic, because it ain't going to work. Right. And here's how it plays out. Going back to 2006, I gave that example earlier. When Bush was doing all of the NSA surveillance and violating the Bill of Rights en masse, 75% of Republicans were completely fine with it, and the majority of Democrats certainly weren't. When Obama comes in, it switches, right? The majority of Democrats are perfectly fine with it as long as their guy's doing it. Whereas the Republicans, a large number of those Republicans who were fine with it under Bush no longer are. This was before Snowden, by the way. So basically, we have the same information, more or less, except things are actually a bit worse. All the Democrats are suddenly fine with it now. We know that. We've seen it. That's not a surprise. But now you understand what's going on in the brain a little bit. Now, so let's get to what the salesmen do. First thing salesmen do is what they don't do. No salesman makes a sale by telling his customer why he's wrong. Why do we do that in politics? Why do we do it? You may as well stop right there. Nobody wants to be wrong. When you go into an argument as if it's an argument, right? You're wrong because, or I'm going to say something that makes you identify me as a political opponent, right? So like I might use vocabulary that makes me a conservative, that sound like a conservative if I'm talking to a liberal. Or I might use a word like, let's say a liberal word phrase like social justice, and it turns off a bunch of conservatives, right? You don't even have to say anything else because I put you on, or put myself on opposite sides of the table, and now I am going to resist. I'm in an argumentative situation, right? A salesman never does that. So the first thing we're going to do in political persuasion is actually not have an argument. We're not going to come at someone telling them why they're wrong. Before we tell them why they're wrong on the issue we want to change their minds about, we're going to find some common ground. We'll get to that in a moment. The other thing we're not going to do is impugn our opponent's integrity or moral character, or indeed intelligence. Again, if you tell me I am less than you, my defenses are up. My entire mind is geared to making you wrong in what you're about to do in making me wrong. I am defensive. You can write this down. There are two different ways I'm going to hear an argument. I might try and filter it through must I believe this, right? Must I believe it, which is resistant, which is I'm looking for a way not to believe it. That's when I'm not on your side, when I don't identify with you. Or there's another way, which is can I believe this? Which is open, which is I like you, I trust you, and I want to believe what you're telling me. So now I'm looking for a reason to believe you. Must I believe? Bar set right up here. can I believe, bar set down here. Moving that bar is an emotional process. My logical argument isn't going to work with anyone who has their bar set high at, must I believe you? If I'm already asking, must I believe you, and looking for an excuse not to, I really only need to find one reason. And if I don't already agree with you, because I already don't share your paradigm, it's almost guaranteed I'm going to find one reason. Okay? So we're not going to do anything to make anybody set the bar high at must I believe. I don't want to believe this person. Why? Well, we all know. Okay? We have never been well disposed to be sold something by a salesman we disrespect, that we know doesn't like us. It works the same with ideas as in products. We don't respect people in almost every case who disrespect us. So here's what we're not going to try and do. When we're changing somebody's mind, we're actually not going to try and change their mind. We're going to kind of clarify their mind. We're not going to give them something that's ours and put it against what's theirs, because everybody defends what's theirs. We're going to invite them to re-examine what's theirs from where they already are. We're going to try and find the common ground. Now, here's the thing. So much more, this is a cliche, but it needs to be said because it's massively true and always forgot, and one of the biggest reasons why we don't have any liberty in this country. Here's the thing that's massively true and always forgot. So much more unites us than divides us. We're united in our humanity, and we're united in our emotional dynamics. We have the same experiences as human beings, in other words. We fear. We get angry. We love the ones close to us. We all want the best for our children. If we have children, for example, me and the next guy, I might be a liberal, they might be a conservative. But if we're both fathers, we have something huge in common. So we have a choice. We can start by finding the common ground, which might be shared experience. Or we can start by finding the shared principle. And there always is one. A fascist can find a shared principle with a communist. Every time. You might have to look for it a little hard, but you can find it and highlight it and experience it together, talk about it together. Or you can go straight to the thing that you disagree about. And just as you can find something you agree about, shared experience, shared opinion, with everybody on the planet, you can find something you disagree about. So don't start on the disagreement. No salesman does. Because what you're going to do, rather than be on opposite sides of the table going against each other, i.e. in opposite directions, you want to find ways to get on the same side of the table and then make the disagreement not a disagreement, but a journey from your shared common ground going in the same direction. And I'm going to give a specific example of that, actually an actual specific example in a couple of slides' time. And obviously, if you come to my day-long seminars, I really go into the mechanisms of this and I give more examples. Okay, so in other words, the experience that the person's going to have with you isn't one that you're trying to force a point of view on them, but that you're offering them something, that you're actually going on a journey with them. And the only way you can go on a journey with someone is by starting where they are. It's easier to start where you want to, just before the end, A, because it's closer to the end, and B, because it's where you might already be. But that doesn't get anybody else to come on the journey with you. Okay. So how do you do that? Well, there's a salesman's adage that works every time. And by the way, I should just say that what I'm bringing to this, if I know anything about this, it's because I'm sales trained. I've done direct sales. I've knocked on hundreds and hundreds of doors. I've sold books. I had no idea that selling books door to door was one day going to help me advance liberty. But I can assure you that's why it turned out all those years ago I had to learn how to do that. But all salesmen know, all good salesmen know, that you have to seek first to understand the customer before seeking to be understood. Absolutely write it down. It doesn't matter. Now, if a customer already comes into the shop, so to speak, if somebody is already at the CSG seminar, then they already want to understand what you're selling them. But most people, when you're kind of being an activist, when you're having to go and implement any of the things that you're learning in a CSG class to save liberty, you're in the city council, whatever it is, they're not there, right? You've got to understand them and let them know that you care about understanding them before you seek to be understood. Why? Because everybody, when you seek to understand them, will tell you how to sell them. They will tell you what they care about, right? In other words, every customer tells you how to sell them if you shut up for long enough. What we often don't do is shut up for long enough to let them tell us how we're going to sell them, what they most care about. Now, not only does doing that give you the information you need to become a weapon of mass persuasion, but people like people who really care about them. So I'm not telling you this is something you do to manipulate or to fake. I am saying you have to realize that everything you believe about your political philosophy, about liberty, never forget that the only moral ends of politics and of liberty are people themselves. If there were no people, there would be no point to politics. There would be no good and bad politics. So actually remember that the ultimate ends are people, including the person who you might be speaking to, who may be profoundly wrong, but nevertheless is one of the moral agents, one of the moral objects of what we're trying to do in the defense of liberty. When people know that you do care about them, they become open, and the way you let them know is by not telling them what you are thinking and what you care about, but by reflecting back to them what they care about. So you shut up and you listen and you let them tell you about what they care about, what moves them. And then you say it back to them in a way that says, I get it. But you can't fake that. You've got to really care enough about getting it. Now, how does this play out in politics? Let me give you an example that's absolutely political, but removed from America so that you can kind of stand back enough to see like the penny drop. In the UK, we have a libertarian, a small L libertarian, I should say, not hardcore libertarian like Americans would call it, but they call themselves a small L libertarian, small D Democratic Party. It's called a UKIP. It's a 20-year-old party. It did not exist 20 years ago, right? Last year, it won the British European election. 20 years old, this party. It's a completely insurgent party. Last year, it got 14% in a general election, right? Like a presidential election in England. How does a party go from 0 to 14%, completely insurgent, in just 20 years? The Libertarian Party in this country, supposedly the most libertarian country in the world, manages 1% in 40 years. And they think that's some kind of success, and it's pathetic, which is why I need to be doing what I'm doing here with you. They did it like this. They discovered what matters to a large minority or even majority of people that they care about, but that was not being spoken to by the mainstream, by the Labour Party or the Conservatives as they are in the UK, akin to the Democrats and the Republicans here. And that issue in England for many years has been the European Union, the tyranny of a supranational state that passes laws for countries that where the people who are passing the laws, they don't even live. Like, the British cannot unelect the folks in the European Union Parliament passing laws for Britain. Now, this is really important. So what UKIP did was say that back to the people. They say this is unfair. All they're doing is saying what those people think. And those people hearing this, the British electorate hearing this, are saying, these guys care about what we care about when nobody else does. And that's how they won the vote. That's how they got 14%. They found the issue that was big but not spoken to by anybody else, and then spoke about it. In other words, they said to a massive number of the British electorate what the electorate was thinking, not what they were thinking. Now, of course, they're a political party. They did say what they were thinking. They did give policy solutions. But I was in England because I was fascinated by this phenomenon, and I asked people about it, did my own little anecdotal research. And I spoke to people who were lefties and righties and not really into politics, and anything in between. And I asked them if they were sympathetic to UKIP. Why the change? Why are you considering this party whose politics are completely different from anything maybe you voted for before? And invariably they would say, well, these are the only guys talking about X. Nobody else talking about it, right? They care about X. It's clearly an issue. They usually didn't actually know what the party actually stood for. Or they certainly never said, I actually agree with them on policy A, B, C, D, and E. No. Because that's not the nature of the connection. The nature of a connection is, I care about something, do you care about something, and let me know you care about it by saying it to me. That's the important thing. Okay? So that's something we always have to do. Tell people what they're thinking, not what we think they should be thinking. That moves the bar from must I believe to can I believe. When I give the next few hours of this, which we're not getting today, I explain that all politics are identity politics. In that when you get into the mechanisms of this, you learn that what you're really doing is getting someone to identify with you, or to get them to believe you identify with them, which means I trust how the world looks from inside your head, basically sharing the paradigm, right? Therefore, I don't have to resist what you're telling me, because what you're telling me isn't going to threaten my current paradigm. Now, let me say a little bit. Yeah, you know what? Let's go to the next slide, and then I will say a little bit about what I want to say. What I wanted to say. There's a number of ways of getting people on side. One is simply to show respect by using their vocabulary and style, right? Now, let me explain how I came to be here. This is what I wanted to say. How I got into this in politics and liberty. I wrote an article in 2011 on the Huffington Post. So for progressives. And I wanted to persuade these progressives that they should vote for Ron Paul. This is 2011, so it's still when the mainstream media were calling Ron Paul an ultra-conservative, right? And a freak. Remember that? They don't call him either of those things now, by the way, which is interesting. But they certainly do. A lot of people still think that. But the media have backed up a bit. But at that time, I was trying to sell an ultra-conservative, old white Republican to the readers of the Huffington Post. How do you do that? Well, what you do is you tell them that they're right. You affirm their good intention. Remember, the politics of the left and the politics of the good intention. So you go to the fundamentals and you affirm them. Because then you say, I acknowledge you're caring and I care like you. So I said in this article, and I urge you, urge you for homework after this seminar, go and check out this article. It was called If You Love Peace, Become a Blue Republican. You can Google that. So I said, if you're one of these Obama-supporting liberals reading the Huffington Post, then I completely respect that you voted against Bush's corporate cronyism, or Bush's Republicans' crony corporatism in 2008 because of Halliburton. I respect that you voted against those unnecessary preemptive wars. And I certainly respect that you voted against the Patriot Act and the takedown of our civil rights, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. For all those reasons, good on you for sticking to your liberal progressive principles and voting Democrat. And because you have those principles, now look at Obama and the other folks in the race and vote for the guy who has a track record on those same principles. So I wasn't telling those liberals that they should give up their principles and therefore vote for an old white conservative Republican. I was saying, by voting for this old white conservative Republican, you will be as liberal as you were when you voted for Obama. You'll be honoring your paradigm, right? And I did it using the language of the people I was targeting, my readers on the Huffington Post, who are generally progressives. And so I say this. I speak to a lot of, I would call myself a constitutional conservative. I speak to a lot of conservative friends who go apoplectic when they hear the word social justice or economic justice, because they know what it means, right? How it's used. And sure enough, I know how it's used too. But if I'm trying to sit down with someone to whom that concept is important, what I need to do is use the concept, is say, I respect where that comes from. I'm going to use it too. Because I can use that language to signify I'm going to engage on that ground without conceding what it has to mean. I can use the term economic justice without, maybe like my progressive friend, believing that we need a huge welfare state to enforce it. I believe that the best way we have of getting economic justice, and that history proves it, is the free market. But if I'm prepared to have a discussion about economic justice, then I'm now on the side of the table with my progressive friend, and he's going to listen to me about the importance of a free market, right? And mutual transactions for mutual benefit. Whereas he's not going to if I go, oh, economic justice, and I start adding, because I know that for him right now that means big state, and I start coming at him against the state. No. So you're going to use people's vocabulary and style, especially the vocabulary and the style that we don't like, especially that. Because why? Well, it does another thing. It subverts the expectations. You see, we all want to put people in our box lazily. We want to work out their paradigm real quick. Because we just want to be able to dismiss everything they're about to tell us. That's what most people do. We've both probably done it and been on the receiving end of it. So, for example, when I was selling those books door to door, if people look at me as a door-to-door salesman, their wall's going to go up, right? Because who wants to buy anything from a door-to-door salesman? So what I would try and do is, if I walked up to a house, somebody's maybe gardening, I would kneel down in the garden, right next to the mum or the dad who was doing the gardening, and I'd start talking about flowers. Why? Because now they can't put me into this is a door-to-door salesman box. In the same way, we want to construct our arguments and use the vocabulary that's going to make that person open to us and not stick us in the box of like, oh, he's one of these freaky constitutionalists or whatever it might be. I know I don't like that guy because he wants to shrink government and there's going to be poor people and blood on the streets, right? We don't want to do that. We want to subvert that expectation. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to meet the objection up front. Hugely, like this is like a magic trick when it comes to political persuasion. I'll tell you how it works. And again, I'll give you an example from both when I was selling those books and also in politics directly. I was trying to sell books that cost $65 a book. And obviously, somebody might love the book, but then you say, and it's $65 bucks, and then I'm not paying $65 for a book. So I knew I was always going to get that objection. So if you know you're going to get an objection, and by the way, if you listen for long enough to hear what people's concerns are, you know what objections you're going to get, or you're going to find out what objections you will get to your political philosophy. You need to get to the objection before they do. It's like this psychological trick. It works like a dream. So in my case, when I was selling books, I knew the objection was going to be, that's too expensive. So before I even got to the price, what I would say is, and these are books to help kids out do their homework, right? So I would start comparing the value of my books, just like you'll compare what your philosophy can do, to the value of other things that might be a lot more expensive, right? So, well, if you wanted to get this kind of knowledge from a set of encyclopedias to help your kid with, pass all these grades, you'd need to spend, $500, whatever it might be. So you can see that the value I've got for just $65 a book, right? This is a bargain. That's basically what I'm saying. Basically what I'm doing is reframing. I'm reframing before we get to the objection. Example in politics. So we call this meet the objection up front. I get there first. If I get there first, so that the customer isn't using it in opposition to my philosophy, I'm already accommodating it in my argument or in my discussion, then I diffuse it. So in politics, in that article that I wrote, the Blue Republican article, here I am trying to sell Ron Paul. I'm explaining that you should be voting for Ron Paul for all of these good liberal reasons against cronyism, against civil rights takedown and Bill of Rights takedown, against unconstitutional war, all good liberal reasons. But I know that any liberal reading this on the Huffington Post is going, yeah, but this guy wants to take down the welfare state. I know that's the objection. So what do? In the next paragraph, I meet the objection up front. I say, now I know, like me, you are concerned about the well-being of the poorest among us. And I give a whole hour on how the left sacralizes victim groups and how the morality of leftist politics is essentially one-dimensional, focusing on the care versus harm dimension of morality. Conservatives operate on other dimensions of morality. But knowing that, I said, like you, I care about the most disadvantaged among us. And you're probably concerned, therefore, about Ron Paul and his views on the welfare state. So I ask you, as good liberals who care about the downtrodden, do you feel that our one-size-fits-all federal delivery of welfare that takes no account of the circumstances and experiences and decisions of the individuals on the receiving end, do you think that's the best we can do with our welfare system? Or is it time to at least have a discussion about that? So there I am, meeting the objection up front and diffusing it. Now, I wouldn't be telling you about this article if it wasn't not for the fact that this article went viral, and I had it from the campaign some months later, the Ron Paul campaign, that the numerically largest coalition of voters that they identified for Ron Paul was the Blue Republicans that was born out of a bunch of progressive readers of the Huffington Post. Think about that for a moment. Here's another principle. Don't tell people what to think. Ask them questions that are going to lead them to where you want to take them. Why? Because, as I discuss at length in later seminars, people treat what they see as theirs differently from what they see as other people's. And again, you can test this in a laboratory as well. So if you ask someone a question and the answer is in the direction you want to go, they will feel it as their answer. It is likely to stick. It is likely to be incorporated into their paradigm, right? People want to believe things that they come up with more than they want to believe things that they're given that really first belong to someone else or somebody else's idea. So we're in the business of leading people to a philosophy, which means that we're taking them one step at a time. We're thinking about where they are and the direction we want to go in, not the destination. If we try and paint a destination of a constitutional, a republic, for example, if my paradigm is so far removed from it, if I don't have the concepts, then I'm just going to see something that I don't get, and my bar is set at must I believe it, and the answer will be no, because it jars with where I am. Because you haven't taken me, and you haven't led me with those questions step by step to understand the things I need to understand about why that destination, philosophically, is important. So we're going to be asking questions wherever we can. We might want to actually do that. Again, if I was sending you homework, I might be getting you to devise like a pipeline of questions that gets us to a point that we want to persuade someone of. And often, by the way, we can formulate them as either or questions. Right? That's something that salesmen do a lot. You say, would you prefer X or Y? And whichever answer you get, X or Y, they're moving in a direction towards your philosophy or your sale. And here's another one, super important. When you've made the sale, stop. When you've made the sale, stop. Now, if you're enjoying this and you think it's useful, you might want to have a radio show. And I've done a number of interviews with folks who kind of have experience in this area. But one of the ones who have the most direct experience was Grover Norquist. And I know you all know who he is, Americans for Tax Reform. And he said something that was really quite remarkable. He said, there is already a libertarian majority, not just philosophically in this country, but at the ballot box. And I nearly fell off my seat. I'm like, how can you say that? 1% Libertarian Party, everybody's voting for these candidates who just want to, roll back liberty, Republican or Democrat, they don't care. He said, because I've done it, said Grover Norquist, because he was working with Reagan. He was involved in putting together the Reagan coalition. And he said, but you have to understand how I mean it. And I actually have on my shelf a book by Grover Norquist, which was surprisingly good, called Leave Us Alone. He says, my Liberty Coalition is the Leave Us Alone coalition. And when I say there's a majority, what I mean is there's a majority of Americans who, on a vote-moving issue, want to be left alone by government. He says there are homeschoolers who want the freedom to homeschool. There are gun folks who want the freedom to bear arms. There are homosexuals who want the government out of their bedroom and out of their marriage, etc., etc. he said, and most of these folks won't agree with each other on most things, but you get them on the issue they want to be left alone on, and you say, that's why your liberty, your freedom is important. That's why government must be limited, and they will agree. And as long as you find that issue and then you stop, you can unite them. And he talked about doing that, uniting the small government, low tax folks with, those who wanted to homeschool their kids for religious purposes, whatever, right? So when you've made the sale, stop. And indeed, when you've made the sale, when you found the common ground and got an agreement, spend more time strengthening the common ground, that sense of shared identity. Okay, so these are just a few examples. Now, somebody who's really good at this, and this is another specific example, is Penn Jillette. And I know I've massively overrun on time, but we're getting close to the end. Penn Jillette has this nice phrase. And again, I want you to think about framing your case, your acts of persuasion in this kind of a way. Penn Jillette, who's a libertarian, says, could we solve this problem by increasing freedom rather than reducing it? That's his formulaic approach to pretty much any issue of the day. Now, there's a number of reasons why this is really good, and it illustrates, encapsulates in kind of one sentence or one question what I'm talking about here. First of all, it's collaborative rather than combative, all right? It says it's putting us on the same side. We're going to do something together, solve a problem, okay? It makes no oppositional argument. It's therefore also humble. And what you give out to people, and salesmen also often say, what you've got to give some to get some. So here's somebody saying, I don't know all the answers, but I'd like to find them with you. But it's interesting because this is coming from a libertarian, and it's clearly geared to move in a direction of liberty. In other words, and it's doing the question versus statement thing. So whatever comes out of this is going to be as owned by the person he's talking to as by him. This one is also really important, and you can write this down. Political persuasion especially, even more than selling products. This is something I've tested. Don't specify a single position until somebody's ready for it. Specify a direction. Yeah? You can argue for a direction much more easily than you can argue for a position. Because let's say, we all want to go towards liberty. Just for example. Some of us have a different idea of what the end goal actually looked like. We have, let's say, constitutional conservatives, minarchists, libertarians, anarchists, anarcho-capitalists. And we all want to go on a bus towards some idea of liberty, and we all want to go into different degrees. We want to go different distances. But we all want to be on the same bus. A bunch of us can agree that, rolling back the surveillance state is a step in the right direction. And loads of progressives will agree on that. But what they might disagree on is what the final, destination looks like. So don't give them the destination 100 paces down the road and end up with an argument. Just let's find the next step that we need to take and because you can only get to, where you need to go one step at a time. We only need to go one step at a time, only argue for one step. And then when we've taken that step, then we argue for the next one. Much easier. How do you eat an elephant? One step at a time. It's true with political persuasion. All right. One step at a time. One mouthful at a time is how you eat an elephant, not one step at a time. Another thing we really like about this is this question, this Penn Jillette's approach, is it doesn't require an ideology to accept there's no ideological premise, right? It doesn't matter who you are, left, right. People believe they want more freedom than less. Now, obviously, let's say, there's people on the left who want to have more gun restrictions and they think that will increase freedom. And all the people on the right, the Second Amendment guys, are like, no, that's a limitation of freedom. It's right there in the Second Amendment. Yes, we will argue about it, but we can still do this journey together. If we're doing the journey together, then at least our argument about what freedom looks like is more likely to get us somewhere together. So by not having an ideology, we're not offering something that's going to be rejected before we even start in that journey. Can we formulate our position non-ideologically. Harder to resist. Pendulette does that excellently. And I've already said that the thing is formulated here, this question is formulated to look to a direction, i.e. what is better and what is worse, much easier to get agreement on, than what is good and what is bad, because then you get arguing about the specific. All right. I already said that identities are, I said this implicitly and I'm going to say it explicitly, when I was talking about UKIP. Shared identities, trust, is established not so much by shared opinions, but by shared concerns. Spanish philosopher, who I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name because I don't speak Spanish, tell me to what you pay attention and I will tell you who you are. Now, I have not spoken to any of you in this classroom. I don't know any of your opinions about any political issue, but I know this. You're students of the CSG, so you care about self-sovereignty. That's all I know. I know what you care about. I now know so much about you and your paradigm without even having to ask you your specific opinions. What you pay attention to is more important than your specifics. If you're someone who posts a lot about LGBT issues, I don't need to know what you post about it to know a huge amount about you. I already have a load of information that's going to enable me to sell you on my constitutional conservatism. I know what I'm going to use. Okay? Because of that, and I'm going to give you this specific example in the moment to close out my presentation, sometimes it's necessary to simply reorder our arguments. Because what we're going to do is start all of our political journeys with people, our journeys of persuasion. We're going to start from where they are, which means from what they care about. Now, in the example I'm going to use, I'm going to preface with this observation. I deal obviously a lot with conservatives and liberals because I'm all about crossing the aisle and uniting people around the ideas of liberty. I believe that the Bill of Rights is essentially unifying. And I believe we need to present it in that way. I believe the Constitution is essentially unifying. But if I'm a liberal, especially given everything that we understood through this presentation, and I'm listening to a conservative, it is completely reasonable to think that because conservatives don't talk much about poverty, that whatever philosophy they give me is less likely to deliver on solving poverty, for example, than somebody who's always talking about poverty. So, for example, right, Bernie Sanders, what's going on? Bernie Sanders is doing on the left what Donald Trump is doing on the right, what UKIP did in England. There are people out there who are very concerned about economic injustice, about poverty. So Bernie Sanders talks about poverty. Now, if you're always hearing about poverty and economic injustice from somebody, that tells you they really care. Subconsciously, we then believe, if we don't already have an ideological objection to the person, that because that guy cares about the problem the most, his solution is more likely to be the best. He's at least the first person we should go to hear the solution. Okay? But conservatives don't start with poverty when they're talking about capitalism, for example. They start with capitalism, and then they get to why that's going to help us with poverty. This is just an example for how to formulate an argument. Okay. Now, I actually suggested when Bernie Sanders recently made a really good video about economic injustice. I'm going to say why it's good. It was nice. It had high production quality. The first 5.5 minutes of this video were just facts about wealth and income distribution in America. Just facts. No ideology. 5.5 minutes, in other words, of people going, oh my God, that's amazing. Oh yeah, I see that in my everyday life. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. 5.5 minutes of that. And then the last 2 or 3 minutes of this video, and maybe you might want to look at it in the light of this presentation as kind of an exercise. The last 2 or 3 minutes, he then gives all his socialist solutions, right? Now, I believe that most of his socialist solutions are going to make all the problems worse. That's my personal belief, and I can obviously give lots of presentations about that too. Because all they try and do is treat the symptoms, not the causes of the problem. I suggested in an article called As Trump and Sanders Push All the Right Buttons, the Liberty Movement Must Wake Up. I suggested that Rand Paul, just to use an example of a liberty candidate that I quite like, could do a lot worse than have put together the exact same video with the exact same first 5.5 minutes, just changing the last 3 minutes, right? So he's is the guy who is seen to care about economic injustice. He wouldn't have to change any of that information at all. He would change, his solutions would obviously be completely different from Bernie. But he would then become the guy who cares. He would start filling the audiences with the same people who were going to see, filling the stadiums with the same audiences who were going to see Bernie Sanders. People would then start associating the care about poverty and economic injustice with the free market, as they should, because the free market is history's best mechanism for dealing with economic injustice. Okay, that's what I believe. Do you see what I'm trying to? Well, you see what that is an example of. So now let me turn this into a specific example that you can use tomorrow, right? Just an illustrative example. So I would hear, for example, a lot of folks that I would tend to agree with politically saying something like, on the left here, I'm a capitalist because I'm for freedom and capitalism is the best way of reducing poverty. Great. I believe that's broadly true. But how much more effective they could be if they simply reformulated it as, I am for reducing poverty, and so support the freedom of people to trade for mutual benefit. That, to me, is what capitalism means. Same content, completely different impact, works with a completely different audience. It preaches to the unconverted rather than the converted. In other words, when you're formulating your argument, ask yourself not to look at the logic and the facts in the argument primarily. Ask yourself, is this an argument about the thing that's going to turn these folks on, or about the thing that turns me on? In other words, the one on the left is about capitalism. It identifies you on the economic right. The one on the left, which has exactly the same content, is about poverty, although it's exactly the same argument, and it identifies you on the left, or it enables you to identify with folks on the left. One last example to close out. The welfare state, and this goes to the question that I was asked earlier. I'm against the welfare state because it doesn't work, it destroys compassion, it increases poverty, ... I've written whole articles about this. I'm very passionate about the welfare state and its destructiveness. Not least because I come from the UK, and where it's much further advanced than in America. And I believe what it does to the society can be horrendously damaging. You might reformulate that one sentence as this paragraph, and I've expanded it to kind of for illustrative purposes. I'm concerned about the loss of compassion for the poorest in our society. I'm concerned how one-size-fits-all programs don't take into account the circumstances of suffering Americans. They don't provide opportunities but disincentivize the very actions that would help people the most. That's why we need a welfare system with better targeting and incentives. I would drive decision-making down toward those whose life welfare affects. If you say that, then the lefty who's listening to you now wants to hear what your answer to poverty is. Let's analyze it. The first sentence, it's in terms of the principles I've been teaching this last hour and 49 minutes, my God. It signals concern. That's important to people on the left. Politics of good intention. Shared identity touches on the moral dimension of care. To understand good intention, you need to understand these moral dimensions, as I say, but that's for a different seminar. Go to my website if you're interested in having me teach a group about that. Next sentence. I'm concerned how one-size-fits-all programs don't take into account the circumstances of suffering Americans. I am talking about suffering Americans, not about a political philosophy. I'm using empathic words like suffering that you hear from the folks on the left. I am showing caring. I am not being ideological. I do not require anybody to agree with me on something already to appreciate that I'm on the same side of the table as them on this issue when I say this. Okay, suffering Americans, I'm being empathic. Again, here, I'm concerned that these current welfare solutions don't provide opportunities but disincentivize the very actions that would help people the most. I'm speaking to the very intent of the welfare system that the folks on the left want to keep. And I'm showing caring.
Robin,
again, I'm showing them I'm one of them.
I'm going to share
and in my humanity, I may not be a leftist, but in caring for people, in trying to get to a better society, I am on the same side of them as them. We all are. We're all together as Americans, we're all together as human beings. This is not fakery. This is true. This is a choice to focus on.
Why don't you go ahead and run through those questions?
So here, that's why we need a welfare system with better targeting and incentives. Now, this one is to be really provocative. You shouldn't be arguing for a welfare system. That's a travesty against political philosophy of liberty. No, excuse me. I don't have to concede the meaning of those words. Let's talk about what a welfare system is. Because I want to talk about how exchange for mutual benefit, which has no negative externalities for third parties, I want to talk about how that advances welfare. That is a welfare system. The free market is a welfare system. And when you come at me and allow me to explain or ask me to explain how I can call that welfare system, I've now got my facts that I'm going to deploy when you ask me to deploy them. Because I have told you by using that word, I want a welfare system too. I just don't mean the same thing as you, but at least we're having a discussion. Okay. You get the idea. So by saying that again, I'm signaling my respect for your vocabulary, your philosophy. I'm identifying with you, and I'm being caring. I'm showing my good intent, etc., etc. I think this is the last one. Yeah, so here's an example of this sentence now. I told you about the importance of arguing for directions, not destinations. You and I, there are 320 million people who would probably design 320 million different perfect welfare systems, maybe. Right, something like that. But we can agree, left and right will agree on this, that we need to drive decision making down toward those whose lives welfare affects. When a conservative hears that, he knows we're talking about shrinking government or moving government down towards the people. When a liberal hears that, we know, what happened there? I didn't even do anything. They hear that we're doing things better for the people who we want to do things better for. Both are true, but you see, that is how we capture that common ground. So there's some examples of implementing those principles. Now I really am done. It's all about Goethe. You see only what you know.